Waiting.
Knock, knock, everyone.
Did I give them one? I can't remember.
Maybe it's your paper.
Maybe. I wonder.
She's going to quit.
That's great.
Hi, I just wanted to alert that you might not be aware of. These small black nubs that you see on the table in front of you are in fact microphones. They're not on during the actual presentation, so you can, talk liberally about whatever is on your mind. But they are actually on during the question and answer sessions. And so if you're shuffling papers or anything in that general vicinity, it's actually going to be picked up on the webcast. So I just wanted to let everybody know that, so that they sit very still and demure during the Q&A sessions. Thanks.
That's high-tech for you.
So I'm trying to comment on your talk.
You don't know what my talk
no
is.
information
I'm
about
sorry.
it.
I apologize.
You wouldn't even
for that.
verbally give me any verbal information.
Well, I tried to.
No.
I think you'll be able to do it on the fly. Let me put it that way.
So we begin the session on ensuring access to essential medicines. I'd like to thank Jerry and Keith for inviting me to this wonderful conference. The speakers have 20 minutes each, and the commentators have 7 minutes. And coming from the dreaded WTO, I will be enforcing these rules with trade sanctions.
Thanks very much, Jayashree. And thanks very much also to Jerry and Keith for the invitation. It's a pleasure to be here. Unlike Alice, who was able to do a number of impossible things before breakfast, I think it's quite impossible to try to describe the ways of resolving the roadblocks to ensuring access to essential medicines in 20 minutes. So necessarily, I'll be picking and choosing. In the book, you'll have about 28 slides. I'll only try to look really at 10 or 12 of them. But I will flip through the ones that I'm not discussing and tell you just briefly the subject matter to review later. You'll recall that the Hydra was the multi-headed beast that Hercules was sent to slay as one of his 12 tasks. The problem of slaying the Hydra, of course, was that by cutting off one head, 2 emerged. I'm not going to try to suggest that we might kill the Hydra of the problems of access today. I'm only suggesting that we might make some progress in trying to think of ways to manage the Hydra. Bob Kahane this morning referred to Harold Lasswell, the lawyer end of the Lasswell-McDougall team. Myers-McDougall was fond of saying it's one thing to describe the Augean stables, another thing to clean them. And I think we confront that same problem with access to medicines. It's in fact an extraordinarily difficult, complex problem set to describe, and necessarily an even more complex problem set to try to clean. I thought it would be in the interest of a presentation on resolving roadblocks to essential medicines to define essential medicines, but in the interest of time, I won't do that, other than to note in terms of cost, the WHO Essential Medicines Division has recently substantially changed in the 12th model list, the listed medicines. Pharma representatives were very fond of saying that patents aren't an access to obtaining essential medicines because most of the medicines on the list, or virtually all the medicines of the list, aren't under patent. Of course, the Essential Medicines Division pointed out the reasons they weren't on the list were they were too expensive for anyone in a developing country to afford, so they weren't put on the list of things they should buy. Partially in reaction to that, the Essential Medicines list now, for example, contains reference to various antiretrovirals and complex anti-malarial medicines. I also simply note that, as everyone in the room I'm sure knows quite well, while HIV/AIDS is a paradigm problem facing the global public health system, it's one of only many serious medicinal problems affecting developing countries. I was asked specifically, and it shows the wisdom of our organizers, not as it were to address the patents medicines debate, but rather to address roadblocks in access to medicines. And I think it's essential, of course, to point out that the roadblocks, while in fact, as we'll get to, patents are indeed a serious obstacle, the problem set is much more complex, involving political, socio-cultural, economic, and legal aspects. And even if we're only looking at the regulatory framework, we have regulation of R&D, safety and efficacy, including liability issues, manufacturing systems and controls, GMP, intellectual property, distribution and dispensing, healthcare personnel, and infrastructure. And there are roadblocks to essential medicines involved in each of these regulatory aspects. We aren't going to successfully address these roadblocks without addressing it on the political side. Public health is one of many competing priorities in terms of resource allocation. Our experience with HIV/AIDS shows us that even a pandemic-level problem is not enough to sufficiently motivate political action, and the public goods aspect of the problem demands that we do resolve this politically, because the market doesn't sufficiently address these very serious issues. Of course, you're all familiar, we have a panoply of multilateral institutions that, at least nominally, are designed to address these issues. But we have a multiplicity of multilateral governance failures. For example, we simply have conflicts in priorities, for example, between the WHO, which approaches things from the public health side, and WTO and WIPO, which approach things from the producer-industrialist side. The activities of these organizations are not coordinated, reflecting their disparate priorities. Individual governments maintain disparate priorities. Internally in the European Union, the Commission is constantly fighting tooth and nail with the pharmaceutical sector. In Geneva, the pharmaceutical industry for the Commission is God's gift to the planet Earth. It's difficult to explain the difference in approach other than to say there's a difference between domestic and foreign priorities. Multilateral institutions have very limited independence. The Secretariat at the WTO isn't an independent policy-making bureau. These decisions are made by national delegations. National delegations are much more, even more so than domestically, subject to capture. Pharma's complete capture of the U.S. Trade Representative's office is an example. Budgets of multilateral institutions are provided by the major industrial powers. Economics-driven institutions, the IMF and WTO, predominate over the soft institutions. And the U.S.'s new approach on bilateralism threatens to undermine all of these institutions. The WTO represents a very specific case of failure. It implicitly assumes that public health is an appropriate subject matter for reciprocal bargaining in trade, and that it's appropriate to trade agricultural subsidies and industrial tariffs with access to medicines. That is, we literally get into debates over trading a cure for cancer and an industrial tariff. Everyone denies explicitly that that's what's going on, but implicitly it's quite obvious that that's what's taking place. Also, in the major OECD powers, all of the external arms are captured, US, EU, Japan, Switzerland. The most extreme example for anyone who's really looking at an over-the-top presentation of public policy is Pharma's recent Special 301 submission to USTR, which quite literally represents a claim to control global public health in every country in the world, very much beyond IPR's issues. Pharma has endorsed the bilateralist approach, and if you want to look at how these bargaining games are played, the recent Paragraph 6 negotiations are a textbook case. Included in your materials is the presentation I recently made at the World Bank on the Paragraph 6 negotiations, which describe this in some detail. There's national political obstacles on the developing country side. I'm going to skip that. A major obstacle is national political obstacles on the developing country side. So some developing countries, Brazil, Botswana, Thailand, Uganda, take a very proactive and aggressive approach to addressing public health issues. China, India, Russia, South Africa have done very little to address some of the major public health problems. And if you look at a country like South Africa, and I'm not going to go through this in detail here, but they have a very complicated internal political dynamic. It's not as simple as President Mbeki doesn't believe HIV causes AIDS. There's much more going on in South Africa under that problem. Sociocultural factors. To cut to the chase, rich people don't really care very much about poor people, at least not enough to change their behavior. So you have to look at de Tocqueville's principle of self-interest rightly understood and convince rich people that chaos in the South is an important factor for actually quality of life in the North. That's not always an easy sell. You know, it's easy to see the military necessities. It's much more difficult to actually focus on the public health necessities. It should be clear we're looking at both a market economics and a public economics failure. The market doesn't adequately address through patents the interests of people in developing countries. If you want to see some very interesting discussions of the market, those of you who are familiar with Sulston's book on the human genome, where he discovers the venality of the market, is quite interesting. But the public sector has not been very effective either. So we really have two sets of failures going on here, a private sector failure and a public sector failure. Scaling in pandemics. I mean, it's quite clear that the capacity of developed countries was very far stretched by something like HIV/AIDS, so that we had to turn to public institutions, the National Institutes of Health, to address the R&D side. We had to address, on the public side, the insurance market failure. A pandemic on the scale of HIV/AIDS simply overwhelms the developing countries. The market can't possibly deal with this kind of problem, and we need an international political response. I won't talk right here about the law as obstacle, but simply to note that, in my view, and I think John Barton was talking about this today, when we talk about developing country populations requiring generic medicines, we're not simply talking about a shift of market control from foreign to domestic producers. Instead, we're talking about establishing a competitive market in which essential medicines are priced near marginal cost, excluding OECD R&D costs. Regulatory side, for those of you who work in this area, it's an incredibly complicated framework. Each country has its own system of regulation outside, for example, the EC system. It creates inefficiencies. The regulatory systems present enormous opportunities for gaming. Anyone who wants to understand the gaming should look at the FTC 200-page report on Orange Book practices. The gaming takes place at a very sophisticated level in the United States. In developing countries where there's no other side to pay attention to the results of the game, the gaming is a much greater problem. Patents are fundamental obstacles to access. At the basic level, they prevent the establishment of production cost-based competitive markets. Now, I understand that that excludes the competition based on patent-based innovation. You know, I say that price is important, and you might think that's just an absurd statement. Why would a human being in front of a sophisticated audience tell us the price of medicines is important? Well, it's only because the U.S. trade representative stood up at the WTO and said the price of medicines is only one modest factor in the access problem. It should be quite clear that a reduction in the price, every reduction in price brings additional participants into the market, and price is a fundamental factor. Many of you are patent lawyers. For those of you who are not, patents are complex and non-transparent legal instruments leading to extraordinary opportunities for legal gaming. They're routinely granted for claims that don't satisfy the criteria of patentability, in some cases countries without examination, in many or all countries with inadequate examination. Medicines involve multiple patents. It's extremely difficult to figure out who has a patent on what. Médecins Sans Frontières has spent 3 years just trying to figure out which medicines, antiretrovirals, are patented in Africa and still hasn't completed the task. The lawyers in developing countries that can effectively deal with the patent system are all retained by the pharmaceutical companies, so there's no public interest side. Legal proceedings are costly and time-consuming, and there's very few people with the incentive to actually try to challenge the validity of a patent. Again, to just address the absurd currency of an argument that patents weren't an obstacle in Africa, first of all, if you look at the patenting pattern, Patents are ubiquitous throughout the major producing and consuming countries in Africa. The introduction of antiretrovirals has clearly been inhibited by patents. I want to step forward, but just note that but other IPRs are a major factor, right? And again, it's a series of fallback positions. If you beat the patent, you've got the trademark. A trademark does have a legitimate purpose. It identifies a source of a good and it provides a valuable public service. But trademarks are also used to block parallel trade, to restrict generic substitution, and to protect against functional coloring. Copyright, when I talk to developing country public health people and say copyright's a problem, they say that's impossible. How could you have a copyright in a medicine? Say, well, there's claims of copyrights in doctor and patient inserts, which have been, of course, litigated in the United States, but they're also problematic in developing countries. We have the major problems with data protection. Well, now we're getting to the solutions to the problems, right? And here, of course, you know, are as many opinions as people in this room. My own view is that for the pandemic-level problems such as HIV/AIDS, you really need, in my perfect world, the IMF would wake up tomorrow morning and say HIV/AIDS is destroying Africa. $10 billion a year is no big sweat. We get rid of the national political obstacles and we begin to address the problem seriously. The U.S. Shouldn't be particularly criticized in the sense that we do as much or more than most other countries, but we've got a new bilateral approach to funding. It suggests that we may be using health policy as a trade instrument. The World Bank is improving its approach. It's beginning to be more proactive in dealing with medicines issues. But developing countries have to be very active in treatment programs, and one of the main points is they always have to be prepared for self-help. Regulatory things, again, things that are going on, things we're familiar with. John O'Quick in the Essential Medicines Division working on GMP certification. Eventually, that kind of certification might be extended to bioequivalence and later on to safety and efficacy. It's important to avoid industry capture in that. National governments have to be very careful on the regulatory review side. Patent holders routinely claim that generic medicines shouldn't be registered by the regulatory authorities. And as we know, and as Carlos Correa has done some seminal work in this area, data protection is really in many ways more insidious than patent protection in terms of blocking access to medicines, and particularly when we're talking about public use of antiretrovirals or other generics. That clearly isn't unfair commercial use under the TRIPS agreement. What do we do with IPRs? Well, clearly workable compulsory license and government use laws are critical. And people tend to focus in compulsory licensing on the difficulties of actually working a compulsory license, which is in fact extremely difficult. But compulsory licenses provide a background for all price and licensing negotiations. They are a direct bargaining tool, and at the end of the day, they permit the realization of alternative production. We have to be careful to not over-glamorize compulsory licensing. You know, when you talk with the production people, it's a long process from 1 year to 3 years to go from granting a compulsory license, reverse engineering, moving up to GMP production, regulatory approval, etc. It's a complex process. But one should not underestimate when you sit down with Glaxo and say we want a license, there's a big difference between saying we want a license and we want a license, and if you don't give it to us, the government's going to grant a government use license. It makes all the difference in the world in the bargaining context. John Barton talked about parallel trade. This is a very complicated subject addressed by many people in this room. I would say that we have somewhat different opinions about the value of compulsory parallel trade in terms of assuring competition. The one point I want to make is that if we do enter into more significant equity pricing arrangements, that we have to be very careful not to allow this to be used as merely a mechanism for enforcing global cartels. And that creates a real risk. If the pharma companies are low-cost pricing, it's going to be very difficult for competitors to emerge, and we have to have ways for that emergence to take place. I happen to believe, and again, this is a subject on which many people in this room have debated the economics, and we have different opinions, that local production and transfer of technology are very important. Local production provides a base for production under government use compulsory licensing. It provides an incentive for government procurement. When you talk to countries in Africa, they're very excited about building plants and buying antiretrovirals produced locally, more excited than buying them from India or Brazil and so forth. And so while we can say in a perfect world we want to rely on efficiencies, when we're dealing in the real world, we also have to understand the importance of what it is that governments want to do as opposed to what it is we'd like governments to think they ought to do. The National Institutes of Health have a budget this year of $28 billion R&D. This swamps any contributions that developing countries might be making to pharma R&D. And that R&D gets converted at the end of a day, sometimes in a complex process, through Duke University to a patent to Merck, et cetera, so it's not always direct. But the NIH budget eventually turns into private sector patents in the United States. Well, one of the things to look at is a more development-friendly orientation to the NIH budget. That is to allow for licensing to developing countries based on ability to pay or nature of use criteria. Of course, the pharma companies in exploiting the patents are returning something to the US economy. They're employing people, they're doing R&D, they're paying taxes and so forth. So it's not an entirely we only take proposition, but one might wonder how you would balance the returns from royalties from developing countries as against using NIH-funded research, and we could suggest similar arrangements for the US and Europe. Drugs for neglected diseases, a specific case of market failure, things like sleeping sickness and leishmaniasis. Médecins Sans Frontières has a major effort going in there. We have a public vaccine development model can be used. We'll recall William Nordhaus's seminal work on subsidies versus patents, suggested the utility of subsidies in a targeted research environments, and also to recall that patents aren't the only potential reward incentive mechanism for new drug development. You can also have various kinds of prizes that are awarded. But you'll see, because we deal with this in Médecins Sans Frontières' issue of drugs for neglected diseases, even when people want to do the right thing and contribute their work to the global public, it's very difficult to work without patents in a patent-based world. So this is its own separate problem set. One thing that we shouldn't overlook is we're going to have some major competition entering this market. Within the next decade, if not sooner, China will emerge as a top-line innovator and low-cost medicine supplier. They have a strong technology-based production capability, a traditional interest in medicines and health. And as they begin to challenge pharma's dominance in the West, one might expect we're going to hear new talk of unfair competition and demand for regulatory controls. Of course, pharma also sees a domestic market in China, but my guess is that the interest in the developed market will swamp the interest in the domestic Chinese market. But China's going to cross the innovation curve, and it's going to be interesting to see if they become an aggressive enforcement of patents. But then they'll be looking for price differentiation between the Chinese and the US markets. Well, what have we got? Well, we've got the Hydra without Hercules. We need political commitment. We need a plan of action. For people working in this area, there's too much to do. We've got to promote additional funding for procurement. We've got to encourage generic production. We've got to impede further efforts to cartelize the global pharmaceutical market. We've got to promote R&D for drugs on neglected diseases. And these immediate demands make the focus on the long term rather difficult. We need a leader from someplace. I won't suggest from where. Thank you.
Well, I'm going to pick up in my remarks on the issue of neglected diseases, or sometimes called orphan diseases. And this is really the last section of my paper. And the paper is broader in scope, but the area that I'm hoping to develop for the conference symposium looks at the area of trying to get at stimulating R&D incentives for orphan drugs and diseases, and particularly using the U.S. orphan drug model as a building block to think about how this might be done. In the process, as background, I'm going to talk some about the economics of the industry, something I've been studying for a long time, and why R&D costs are high, and some work on R&D costs and returns. I'm going to try to move through that very quickly, but this is work currently in press. Okay, the challenge here is basically how do we encourage more investment in new drug therapies for diseases of the third world, malaria, TB, that affect millions of individuals, but who have limited ability to pay. And the challenge is also that we develop those new drugs, that we have them priced so they can be afforded, and that there's a distribution system that will deliver them to the people who need them. Now, from a market system, the problem, well, before, let me say, just in reference to the problem here is very similar, at least from an economic perspective, to the orphan drug problem. The orphan drug problem, as it's been called, is for people with rare illnesses like Wilson's disease or Huntington's diseases. Very small patient populations traditionally had very little new drug development. And in counterpart, what I'm going to be talking about is the orphan disease problem, but using some of the successes of the orphan drug problem as instructive. Now, from a problem from a market perspective is basically the R&D side. It's a very long, costly, and risky activity, essentially very high fixed cost, and the expected revenues from orphan diseases and orphan drugs don't justify research, at least if you're a profit-maximizing firm that has a responsibility to your shareholders. There's some work that I'll talk about in a drug donation phase, but there hasn't been traditionally much work relating to diseases of the third world. And so let me look at the economics, sort of whip through this quickly. But it gives you a feel for what some of the obstacles are here. Sort of first question, why is R&D process for new drugs so long and costly? Basically, it's a process with lots of scientific, regulatory, and economic uncertainties. You have to go through a decision-making process under uncertainty that involves multiple phases building up to thousands of patients. And at the end of the day, most new drugs that are tested clinically don't reach the market. And here's from a large population, here's the phase probabilities. I think a lot of you are aware that drugs go through when they go in the clinic, first in phase 1 in individuals to test dosing and safety, not necessarily patients. This is a small number. Then it goes through a first phase of double-blind studies to test efficacy, and then finally large patient clinical trials involving thousands of patients. And from our universe, these are the odds. If you go into phase 1, 30% drop by the wayside. You have 70% continuing on. In phase 2, it's 44%. Phase 3, 70%. And if you say, well, if you start phase 1, what's the chance of emerging as a new drug? You got to multiply 71% times 44% times 68%, and you get 21%, which is 1 in 5 drugs that are tested in man get approved. And before you even get to man, you're looking at targets, you're looking at lead drugs, you're testing thousands of drugs in the laboratory and then in animal tests. So even with the best science, there's a lot of attrition. And this is another way of looking at it. If you think about it as a pharmaceutical firm does, if you want to have 1 new drug every year or 1 or more, what do you have to sort of think about if you have these kind of averages? Well, you have to think about maybe there's 5 drugs in phase 1 for every one that gets approval 3.3 in phase 2, 1.46 in phase 3 to get, on average, one drug. And if you want this year after year, then here's to get one drug for this year, you need a pipeline spaced over time of 10 drugs at different phases. But if you want this year after year, at any given time, because the process stretches out to 8 to 10 years, you have 100 drugs in the clinic or more. And then you have preclinic, many more drugs that are feeding into this funnel. Okay, this is some research that gives some figures on average cost at different phases. The average phase 1 trial is 15 million, the average phase 2 trial 23 million, the average phase 3 trial 86 million. This is from a sample of major pharmaceutical and biotech firms that we sampled, where we picked a representative sample and we used their cost data. And so this is if the drug is successful on average in the 90s, a little over 100 million, 125 million, I think, if you added that up. But of course, this doesn't have the cost of failures in, so then if you added the failures into this, the fact that you have to do 5 phase 1 trials for everyone that's successful and so on, you get numbers that now begin to look like 280 million, and behind that is a little over 100 million in preclinical, and we get a cost figure of 400 million. And then we also have a concept of capitalized costs, which I won't go into much detail, but basically your R&D cost is tied up for 10 years. You could have put that money in the bank and earned a bond rate of interest or put it into bonds at 5%. What's appropriate as an economist, if you think about your opportunity cost, is what could you earn on an investment of comparable riskiness. We use various techniques, and we get a capital cost of another 400 million, or this would be a total of 800 million. And this is an average cost, and there's lots of variability around this cost. So to summarize this R&D cost work, and this is in press at the Journal of Health Economics, and we've done this for different cohorts, R&D costs are growing at a rate that's much faster than the rate of inflation. And what seems to be driving the process is much bigger clinical trial sizes. There are now several thousand patients. The late 90s, some of the data suggest patient trial sizes on average of 5,000 or more. And that plus the cost per patient is increasing the cost over time. We spend a lot of time in our work trying to validate these numbers. Since we got them from the pharmaceutical industry, we look at external checks on this. The OTA did an initial check on an earlier paper. The Congressional Budget Office has worked with these numbers as well, given the political nature of the pharmaceutical industry. I won't go into that, but that's into the paper that's coming out. There's a lot of variability around this average. Depending on a drug's therapeutic area, depending on how innovative it is, whether it's another drug in an existing class or represents a whole new class, there can be a wide range, and we're developing a paper on that. Some of the new technologies coming down the pike, genomics and related technologies, have the promise of higher success rates and lower cost in the future, but they may paradoxically mean higher cost in the short run while you're making the investments in these new technologies. And in terms of infectious diseases, one optimistic note is they tend to be on the lower end of this, except for some of the recent new AIDS therapies. Infectious diseases, there's a better model for predicting success. The genomes of some of the bugs are going to allow that as well. So it may be that you can produce a drug for infectious diseases much less than the 400 million odd of cost that is the average. Well, moving on, I'll say a few things about returns. of pharmaceutical firms. This is another paper. Basically, if you use this R&D cost number and then look at the portfolio of drugs that were introduced in the period of the early 90s for the industry as a whole, and look at sales curves, one of the findings here was that you needed essentially $400 million of peak sales to cover average R&D cost. And the distribution is very skewed. A small number of drugs cover a large percentage of the revenues. And in that sense, this is a lot like venture capital, where you get a small number of drugs in big markets covering a lot of the process, the fixed cost of the process. And this is from that work, and it shows that the average returns for 90 to 94 drugs, a typical sales curve versus 80 to 84. Costs have gone up, but so have sales. The average drug in the industry is profitable. This is a profitable industry. On the other hand, its profits are driven a lot by a small number of compounds. This is a look at the distribution, and we've done this for several different cohorts, and you can see that that if you rank the drugs that came out in a given period by deciles, with the biggest selling drugs in the first decile, and say how much of the cohort's present value or sales did they account for, it's around 50% are in the top 10% of the drugs. And what these drugs are new drugs for cardiovascular disease. They tend to be concentrated in areas like depression, schizophrenia, new CNS drugs, new biotech drugs, some of the big antibiotic drugs, the first in class, the best in class, and they tend to earn large profits, and they tend to carry a lot of drugs that don't have high profits relative to the fixed cost. And we could get into why this is so. There's a lot of uncertainty. A lot of times you don't know what your drug profile is until late in testing. At that time, it's still useful to go ahead if there's some incremental contribution. Okay, let me turn now with that economic background to the main issue here of this section, which is how do you, if you're dealing with a small patient population or a patient population that has very low resources, how can you change the incentives economically so that drugs will have R&D, will come to the market, and will be distributed? And you can think of push programs, which are R&D cost sharing or subsidies and regulatory fast-track treatment, or you can think of pull programs, which are things like market exclusivity provisions, a guaranteed purchasing agreement, or transferred exclusivity or fast-track credits to drugs, to work on drugs for small populations, or for neglected diseases you get some goodies for or some benefits transferred to drugs that are in the market. The 1983 Orphan Drug Act illustrates this push-pull scenario. In roughly 20 years ago, the government passed the Orphan Drug Act, and it put in a series of factors, an R&D tax credit of 50% on clinical trials. It's qualified in various ways. A small research grant program, accelerated fast-track treatment at the FDA, and a guaranteed market exclusivity of 7 years. And the market exclusivity it runs concurrently with the patent life, but it's separate from the patent life, and it can be stronger than a patent in the sense that if you had a process patent, this would be much stronger. It's a market exclusivity that would guarantee you this this exclusivity, and many biotech firms were working on drugs that had small markets, and this feature tended to be the most important to them, along with the accelerated reviews at the FDA. Well, here's some data. After 1983, on average, 12 new drugs with orphan indications or indications for rare illnesses came out per year, as opposed to 1 per year in the period. So many new drugs. Since 1983, there are like over 200 drugs that have come out for orphan indications or with approved orphan indications, compared to only a fraction of that beforehand. Here's some data on the economics of the orphan drugs that just developed, and in your packet, I don't think you have this curve. You have some similar things, but here's the non-orphan case in 1994. The typical drug, or the mean drug, had a peak sales of 500 million, where the mean orphan drug had a peak sales of 100 million. And it turns out there are a few wealthy orphans. So there were a few drugs that skew this mean. If you look at the median, it's only 30 million. There were a few drugs like Neupogen that got orphan drug status, even though its orphan indication was a minor part of its use. And then there were some drugs like Ceridase, used for Gaucher's disease, where even though it was a small patient population, they were able to get insurance companies to reimburse a very high price per patient, and it was a successful drug from commercially. But basically, what this is telling me is that orphan drugs can come out with sales of less than 100 million, the median being 30 million, that in many cases they have R&D costs that are very different from a big cardiovascular drug or an antidepressant drug. Basically, they have often negotiated a deal with the FDA where they can come onto the market based on a phase 2 trial, one pivotal trial with several hundred patients, not several thousand patients, and that has allowed a lot of orphan drugs to come to the market. There's some recent work by Lichtenberg and Walfogel that look at the healthcare benefits. They found in this last 2 decades that there's been a rapid growth in the use of prescription drugs by individuals with low prevalence diseases, and that this has led to fewer deaths and increased longevity in this patient population. Here's one statistic from their work. Essentially, one of the indexes they focus on are people dying at an early age, less than 55. And if you look at disease prevalence, individuals in the 25th percentile with, which is the rare illness area, you can see that in 1979, 22% of those individuals died before 55. By 1998, it was 16%. And at the 75 percentile, this is the major diseases that stroke, cancer, and various other diseases. There's also a gain in fewer people dying before the age of 55, but it's much less. And they do a statistical analysis and relate this to the orphan drug case. Well, the conclusions, the Orphan Drug Act has been a success in encouraging many new drug approvals. Technically, drugs for neglected diseases or orphan diseases, diseases of developing countries, are eligible for orphan drug status in the US because there's very few cases of malaria. In the law was anything with less than 200 cases, a prevalence of less than 200 individuals, is eligible for orphan drug status. And these drugs, for malaria and other diseases, would be eligible, but there's been very few approvals. And I think the issue there is that we need some market pull incentives to complement the cost incentives. And a few minutes I have left, I'll talk about some of those, some ideas along those lines. Also want to mention drug donation programs which are discussed in the paper, that in a few diseases, firms have pushed ahead with drug donation programs for particular diseases, the most notable being Merck's ivermectin for river blindness. Basically, this was a case, an anti-worm drug that emerged through veterinary medicine that was then discovered to be very useful against river blindness, and Merck went ahead and did this based on a public affairs basis. Now, and there's other examples of this, but this isn't going to we can't rely on drug donations to really be the main source of the solution to the problem. There's some proposed market pull programs. The idea of a market guaranteed purchase plan by economists like Sachs and Kremer. Basically, this would produce a fund for new vaccines for malaria, TB, or AIDS. There would be this fund would be put together through public and private funds. LCDs would have a fund also and would have some control over whether to adopt this and have to pay a small co-payment to ensure that it met a market test. And basically, this is a variation on the prize idea that we've talked about. The authors claim it has some advantages over just a lump sum prize because of its adaptability. Sometimes a drug or a vaccine will come to the market. It will have to be withdrawn. And if you've already awarded a prize, it will, the money has already been delegated. And it also has advantages over just cost subsidies because you only pay for successes. It has various other issues in terms of credibility. You have to set up a system. What happens if more than one firm gets to the market with this? You have to think through all of those issues. Some other market pull programs that we'd like to work on here and over the next year is particularly the idea of a fast-track credit that you could, if you agreed to work on priority diseases, priority neglected diseases, you could have some fast-track credit at the FDA, which would allow you to jump to the head of the queue. The FDA currently has two classifications, a standard drug and a priority drug. Most drugs are listed as standard. Priority drugs tend to be cleared in 6 months. Standard drugs in a year, and if you had this R&D credit, it would provide some kind of a transferred incentive. Now, what are the kind of cost of that? Well, you don't want a standard drug to jump over a new drug that's a valuable new drug. You don't want a standard drug to jump over a U.S. priority drug, but if you jump to the top of the priority queue, or if you provided more resources at the FDA, this could be a very powerful mechanism, and some of our simulation indicates this is a more powerful mechanism than adding more exclusivity at the end of the patent life of a drug. Giving economic incentives up front are much more powerful than ones at the end. So this is an idea that I think we could we're planning to see how practical it is. There's some slides here that I won't go into on public-private partnerships, but this is an alternative approach where instead of relying on decentralized market forces, you rely on some of the same principles, but a single firm or a single organization like the TB Alliance manages a budget, creates a portfolio, tries to use all of the strategies of the pharmaceutical firm, uses IP in a strategic way to get work done. And the Gates Foundation and other agencies have given a lot of priority to this approach. And this is some results from an RTI study that I participated in, where looking at a fast-track approach to a new TB drug, instead of costing $400 million, if you could do it with one pivotal trial, it may cost you $115 to $240 million. It's still a lot of money, but significantly less than the average R&D cost. So the conclusions here, the Orphan Drug Act has been very successful in stimulating drugs for rare illnesses. One hopes to duplicate that success for drugs of neglected diseases, but we're very much in an experimental phase at the current time on which approach is best.
Yeah, sure. She wants the cards back.
So I need to begin with a disclaimer. When Jerry Reichman first approached me about participating in this very interesting conference, he didn't ask me to talk about access to essential medicines. He instead asked me to talk about something that I know much more about, which is patents and tech transfer. But at the time, the meeting was far off, and I thought it would be better for me to commit myself to talk about something that I wanted to learn more about, rather than to talk yet again about something that I've talked about and written about many times before. So I asked Jerry if I could instead talk about access to essential medicines, and I can't remember his exact words, but he said something like, "That's something of a stretch for you, isn't it?" And I probably should have heeded this gentle warning. I probably should have realized that any panel that Jerry would put together on this topic would include not novices like myself, but world-renowned experts with lots of data in their slides and so forth. I have no slides and no data, but I really couldn't help myself, so here I am. I'm feeling like sort of a lay member of the panel or something. So why was I drawn to this topic? Why did I want so much to get into this? Well, I've been studying patents in biomedical research for many years now, and that's been a focus that has usually allowed me to feel pretty good about the patent system. It's not without its blemishes and embarrassments, some of which I've written about, but it seems to me to be doing what I think a patent system is supposed to be doing, which is promoting private investment in R&D, at least in the biopharmaceutical arena. Whatever else you can say about the pharmaceutical industry, I think most observers would concede that they spend a lot of money on R&D by the standards of other industries, and that it's a very patent-sensitive industry. The patent system has made them more willing to do that than they would be without patents. I don't think you can say that about every industry, but I'm prepared to say that much about the biopharmaceutical industry. So, I squirm a little when I read about the impact of the patent system in other fields where it seems to be doing perhaps more harm than good, like information technology, business methods. At least it's questionable, I think, whether on balance patents are promoting or hindering R&D. But I like to think that at least in the corner of the R&D universe that I observe, biomedical R&D, patents are promoting at least investments in R&D. They may be creating, doing some mischief along the way. It's not a perfect system, but I think it's bringing a lot of funds in to do a lot of research. And I like to think that the R&D that the patents are promoting is very important R&D, has high social value. It generates new technological advances that prolong and improve people's lives, and that therefore, at least in this technological context, patents are a good thing. So for me, the problem of access to essential medicines in developing countries and least developed countries has been a persistent source of embarrassment to me as I try to hold on to this worldview. More broadly, I think it's becoming a growing embarrassment for the patent system overall, and that's very unfortunate. It highlights, I think, a significant downside to patent protection in a technological setting where patent protection really seems to matter to innovation incentives. Although there are few industries where patents have been more successful in motivating private investment in R&D, at the same time, I got to admit that in no other context does the economist's phrase "dead weight loss" convey more aptly the resulting social costs associated with the high prices charged for patented products. Indeed, I think recurring conflicts over access to drugs have caused the pharmaceutical industry to appear as an obstacle to human health, rather than as a major investor in technologies to improve human health. Although controversy over terms of access to patented drugs has been framed repeatedly as a legal problem on both sides of the debate, it's not clear to me that it really is a legal problem, or it's not clear to me whether or how far intellectual property law is to blame. And that's what interests me. The pharmaceutical industry, I think, gives mixed messages on this point. On one hand, they insist that patents aren't the problem. Patents are not what keeps drugs from reaching sick people in developing and least developed countries. They point out that many of these countries lack essential infrastructure for providing health care and distributing drugs. They lack resources to pay even for drugs that are off patent and available in generic form. Then, on the other hand, they duke it out aggressively over any legal maneuver that any of these countries attempt in their efforts to improve access to medicines, sometimes by filing their own lawsuits to set aside laws that violate their own interpretations of the TRIPS agreement, as they've done with laws in South Africa and Brazil, sometimes by enlisting the U.S. trade representative and Congress in their cause by imposing or threatening trade sanctions under U.S. law or the withholding of U.S. aid. So all of these moves, I think, suggest that, maybe these legal rules really do matter. Maybe they are doing some real work here, enough to be worth fighting over. And the developing nations have also responded in the legal arena by seeking international agreement, most recently, conspicuously, over the meaning of relevant TRIPS provisions that they rely on in seeking to improve access to essential medicines in order to forestall the threat of litigation over legal rules. And again, this suggests that law is the essence of the problem and the place to look for solutions. Now, maybe they're right, and maybe this will ultimately prove useful, but somehow I suspect that it's largely a sideshow, that we're putting a lot of energy into adjusting the legal rules surrounding a problem that ultimately is not about legal rules. Now, when I question whether law is really the essence of the problem here, I don't necessarily mean to repropound the pharmaceutical industry's story that even if there were no patents, people in developing countries would still have little or no access to drugs, although I don't necessarily disbelieve that story. That may be pretty close to describing a lot of problems with access to essential medicines in the least developed countries right now, because the transition provisions of TRIPS have given developing nations extra time before they have to issue patents on drugs, and for some of these nations, these time periods were recently extended in the Doha Declaration on the TRIPS agreement and public health. There are a lot of essential medicines that aren't covered by patents in the least developed countries, and some of these drugs are unprotected even in developing countries with domestic capacity for manufacturing drugs. Jamie Love tells me that there are many drugs that are covered by patents in the only African nations where there's likely to be any market for these drugs, and that may be true too, but there certainly are some circumstances where there's an unpatented drug that could be manufactured in India or Brazil and sold in sub-Saharan Africa without violating any patent rights, and we don't see that happening. So at least for much of this problem, we're looking at a world that has in place little or no patent protection for some essential medications in some countries that, especially in Africa, that nonetheless lack effective access to these medications. Now, the focus of the Doha Declaration on interpretive moves to permit the use of compulsory licensing so as to allow the importation of generic versions of these drugs into countries that lack domestic pharmaceutical manufacturing capacity invites speculation that this is where the problem is. Maybe compulsory licensing that is limited to domestic production for domestic use isn't good enough. The TRIPS agreement needs to make more room for access to generic versions of drugs. But I remain skeptical that that's the heart of the problem, partly because, when I look at the law doesn't really look that restrictive to me, and partly because people aren't fully using the flexibility that current law provides. Now, another huge problem, of course, is just the lack of resources to pay for these drugs, even if they were priced at marginal cost. This is a market problem in the developing countries, a lack of effective demand for drugs in poor countries, not a legal problem. But even if we could find benefactors willing to buy these drugs at marginal cost or marginal cost plus a smidgen for distribution in the least developed countries, if we could find, maybe MSF or the Global Fund or maybe George Bush, who's out there telling us we can do this for $300 a person, I think we would quickly run into another market problem that might be more intractable. And this market problem has less to do with ineffective markets in poor countries than with effective markets in rich countries. And I suspect that's why the pharmaceutical industry was so upset with George Bush for announcing in his State of the Union address that we could provide AIDS drugs to treat patients in Africa at a cost of $300 per year. The problem, of course, is that if we could provide these drugs at a cost of $300 per year to treat patients in Africa, we could also provide the same drugs to treat patients in the U.S. At a cost of $300 per year. And the pharmaceutical industry is terrified that that is the inexorable endpoint of starting down this road, not because of law, but because of markets. And not because of ineffective markets, but because of increasingly effective markets. Let me delve a bit further beyond my comparative advantage on this panel to talk about the market for drugs. From an economic perspective, price discrimination seems like the obvious solution to the essential medicines problem, right? If folks in sub-Saharan Africa can't pay as much for essential medicines as folks in the US, but maybe through benefactors they can still come up with enough money to cover the marginal cost of supplying the product to them. One might expect that that would happen somehow. One might expect to see developers of patent-protected products sell them at a cheaper price in sub-Saharan Africa than in the US. This happens in lots of other settings where sellers are able to draw a reasonably bright line between those who can pay or are willing to pay more and those who can't. So, for example, we see cheaper student ticket prices, early bird specials for seniors, night and weekend minutes on cell phone calling plans. These are all examples of price discrimination. And none of these examples provokes much indignation among consumers of the higher-priced versions of the product. I don't want the early bird special. I don't want to go to the matinee. I don't want to place my call after 9 p.m. And I'm willing to pay more for the difference. And it doesn't really bother me that people of lesser means are willing to trade off convenience for a cheaper price. In fact, I can feel good about it because the differences correspond fairly well to ability to pay and willingness to compromise on certain non-essential product attributes. And price discrimination looks like a good thing. More people gain access to products and services at prices that they can afford. Welfare is enhanced. Now, of course, there are limits to price discrimination. Price discrimination only works if you can prevent arbitrage. That is, if you can keep entrepreneurs from buying the goods cheaply in the low-price market and reselling in the high-price market in a way that undercuts profits for the price-discriminating firm. And this can be a concern for people who sell drugs because drugs are the sort of product, small, lightweight, high value, that might be easily, oh my goodness, I can't believe it, that are readily transported around the globe in search of a profit. And in fact, we see robust markets in illegal drugs in many places. So one legal issue that might determine the feasibility of international price discrimination is effective protection against arbitrage. But I think we have effective protection against arbitrage. It's not so clear that we have it under the patent laws, actually, under the US patent laws or under patent laws of other nations. because this is an issue on which the TRIPS agreement allows nations to differ in their provision of patent protection. The U.S. bargaining position has been, supported by the pharmaceutical industry, has generally favored imposition by treaty of a uniform rule of national exhaustion, but we don't have that by treaty, and it's not even clear that we have that as the law in the U.S. There's a recent decision of the Federal Circuit that seems to say as much in passing, but the U.S. Supreme Court has arguably held otherwise in the copyright and trademark context. But despite the uncertain coverage of U.S. patent law, the pharmaceutical industry still enjoys substantial legal protection against parallel imports of drugs into the U.S. because of FDA regulation. There are labeling requirements that are country-specific, that there are various differences in drug approvals that make it pretty difficult to import into another market drugs that were manufactured for sale into another market. And this is an interesting counterpoint, I think, to the push toward harmonization of national regulations to promote free trade. The most enduring obstacle to parallel trade in drugs may prove to be national differences in drug regulation that make products manufactured from one market difficult to sell elsewhere. This is fortified in the U.S. by the Prescription Drug Marketing Act of 1987, which specifically prohibits reimportation of previously exported U.S. manufactured drugs, except by the manufacturer, unless it's required for emergency medical care. But whether it's legal or not, some reimportation is plainly happening. Recently, we've seen the pharmaceutical industry in the U.S. fighting arbitrageurs who buy drugs in Canada and Mexico and sell to patients in the U.S. And these efforts are getting a lot of attention in the press. Interestingly, I think the prevailing spin here is not to condemn these arbitrageurs as scofflaws, but to applaud them for fighting the outrageous prices that drug companies are charging to U.S. consumers. I think this is a really interesting and important development. In these political debates over reimportation, price discrimination has been pictured as perverse and unfair rather than as welfare enhancing. In the market for drugs, price discrimination has often worked in ways that leave poorer people paying more than richer people. And this really casts a very different light on price discrimination and whether it's something that we should like or something that we should hate. In the U.S. market for drugs, bargaining power rather than ability to pay determines who gets the best prices for drugs. And that means that poor, uninsured people typically pay substantially more for drugs than PBMs pay for the same drugs for their insured customers, often much more. And this has been much remarked in the press in the course of debates about adding a prescription drug benefit to Medicare, because many seniors have no drug coverage and pay the premium prices. This seems to go against the standard argument for price discrimination as welfare enhancing. Reporters have no difficulty finding senior citizens who are barely making ends meet, who pay hundreds of dollars a month for products that are available or at much cheaper prices for the use of patients who have health insurance. These stories make price discrimination look like a weapon of the heartless rather than a tool of the enlightened. Rather than making products available further down the demand curve, it seems to be yanking products beyond the reach of people of ordinary means, and this makes for a tough political environment for seeking legal protection against arbitrage. But ultimately, I don't think that's the real problem. I think the pharmaceutical industry has the protection it needs. The real problem is the market. Again, not a failing market, but an effective one. Payors are driving ever harder bargains with drug companies, and they're feeling the squeeze. As drug costs rise, payors are getting more serious about getting them under control. PBMs consolidate the purchasing power of multiple insurance plans. States are getting together to bargain over prices for Medicaid drugs. They increasingly turn to formularies to bring about price competition between patent-protected products in the same class. The pharmaceutical industry has sometimes fought back in court as if it were illegal to bargain with them. But a series of judicial decisions have basically approved all of these cost containment strategies of public payors. the public sector and the private sector copy each other's techniques, sometimes tag along to each other's prices, insist on most favored nation treatment, and all of this is really beginning to hurt. These developments are very threatening to the pharmaceutical industry's pricing strategies in their most lucrative markets. But the threats that these pose arise from a robust market, not from a malfunctioning one. So what does all of this have to do with access to essential medicines? Well, I think when you're bargaining hard, you don't want to disclose your reservation price. So as the pharmaceutical industry is negotiating with PBMs and hospitals and state Medicare programs, they don't want to tell them their marginal costs. They don't want to talk about their marginal costs. If they agree to sell essential medicines at bargain prices in sub-Saharan Africa, or even permit others to do so, they reveal very valuable information that might undercut their bargaining position in the markets where they make their money. And I suspect that this is the real threat posed by the focus on access to essential medicines, what my colleague Peter Hammer refers to as informational arbitrage rather than arbitrage in drugs as such. It's easier to keep drugs from moving across borders than it is to keep information from doing the same. And by selling AIDS drugs at $300 a year, firms are releasing valuable information that goes straight to the front pages of the Wall Street Journal. So when you combine that information with the growing indignation of the American public at price discrimination in healthcare, super competitive prices for drugs in the US are becoming a very hard sell. I'm over time, so I will stop.
Okay.
Is there a little mouse thing that you were using?
Yeah.
Did somebody just turn this? What's that? Well, I took advantage of the hour and a half before me to actually try and be responsive to what people said. So it's the same file, but it's on the little movable disk. Are you manipulating it up there? Okay. You can just cancel out. Don't try to install the thing. You don't need to. Is this going to take a while? Should I just, no? Okay, 30 seconds, okay. My name is Jamie Love. I work in Washington, D.C. My background's in economics. Before the show started, I've been working on these issues. I met Carlos Correa in Argentina in 1994, and learned the U.S. government was more interested in speeding up the period under which Argentina would comply with the TRIPS agreement than they were over whether they maintain a constitutional democracy in Argentina. And that was sort of a wake-up call for me of what trade policy was about. Now, I'll just sort of go over a few things while the technical staff here is trying to figure out how to read from this little gizmo here. And I hope you're accommodating me on that. But this notion that companies don't care about, I mean, all they care about developing countries is revealing their price is ludicrous because no,
it's a good try.
Never mind.
Hold your breath.
I'll start out with just a little empirical fact, and that is that for 30 years, India's been producing very cheap generic drugs, and anybody that wants to can just basically go over to India and find out what the marginal cost of these products are, and that hasn't really done much to destroy the bargaining power of people in positions. I've never seen somebody seriously in the United States demand that Merck sell its products at marginal cost. I don't think that's really the nature of the negotiations. Now, I'm just going to, this is the way I go, right? How does this work? Oh, where do I, right here? Okay. Now, this is a quote from Gagne, who's the head of GSK, which is a big pharma company, in The Guardian a few weeks ago. And he says, if you shut them out of 80% of the world's population, that's where basically the poor people live in the world, it's not fair. They're very big on fairness, the drug companies. And if the patents go away in those countries, it's the end of the pharmaceutical industry as you know it. That's the real problem that Big Pharma has. That's basically what they see as their future as the developing countries. And they don't want to give it up because a couple of AIDS activists are embarrassing them over, you know, some problems. And they'll do whatever they can to maintain the basic infrastructure, even if they have to concede a few ARVs in Africa. They don't want to give up on the big picture for them. Now, this is the patent status for ARVs. I mentioned it because there's all this sort of urban legend within everybody who's ever been within 5 miles of a pharma rep and read the Acheron paper. So it's true that there are some ARVs that are not under patent very widely. They're all patented in South Africa, which is significant because if you don't get into South Africa and you don't get into Brazil, the only 2 countries with a significant purchasing power for ARVs, you can't really have economies of scale and you can't really do much. You can't bring the price down. But among the ones that are widely patented, any cocktail you can make for under $500 a year is patented like crazy in about 30-some countries. So if you actually gave a rat's ass about treating ARV patients in Africa, you would know, as I know, that the cheapest cocktail you can manufacture involves 3-TC, nevirapine, and D4T. Without access to the 3-TC patent, without access to the nevirapine patent, you can't sell it in 33 countries in Africa. And if you can't sell it in those countries, you're making a big mistake. Now, this is a Thailand story. This was the first major success of an NGO on a drug thing. And this was not a patent. This was a regulatory exclusivity the U.S. government forced on Thailand because they didn't have a patent when the product was put in the market. But we just said, you got to provide exclusivity irregardless of this patent thing. And it was used for toenail and vaginal fungus was the main market. It was marketed for 200 baht a pill. And it was also used for cryptococcal meningitis, which leads to blindness and death. It's a brain fungus. It's very painful. They call it the exploding head disease. When they got the exclusivity removed in 1998, the price fell to 6.5 baht in about 9 months, and everybody who needed access to fluconazole got it in Thailand. It was a remarkable, complete, clear-cut competition versus no competition, access versus no competition, and everybody, including, of course, Pfizer and all the big guys, they all learned the same lesson from that. And that's what kicked off, really effectively, the movement of the AIDS activists toward looking at competition as a remedy for some access problems. Well, this is the familiar stories, I guess, in Africa. These are real people that are really struggling to do things there. Now, this is a very recent thing in February involving people in Korea. Now, they're not lucky enough to have like a headlining disease like AIDS. They just merely suffer from leukemia, and it's a rare form of leukemia. It's not an epidemic or it's not a contagious thing like SARS that'll get in an airplane and come back here. Novartis is charging $50,000 per year for the rest of your life for this product. Richard Rockefeller takes it. It's a very good drug. It wasn't a gazillion patients. It was 1,000 patients in the clinical trial. It was registered very quickly. It was relatively cheap and a lot of federal support. Now, this is a product that, often orphan drug, government, has tax credits for the trials and everything you can imagine. Well, these are people that went to the hospital somewhere, beat up pretty bad by the cops in a demonstration. The government actually has agreed to pay 90% of the drug, but the 10% is $5,000, which is more than people that have leukemia, working class people, can afford. So it's not just, I point out, it's just not just about AIDS. Now, are the drug companies insane? That's part of the argument we have. Apparently it costs, half the gross national product to bring every drug on the product, and yet they're mindlessly bringing these products on. They're losing money because they don't earn the gazillions of dollars, and so we have to solve that problem. But it might occur to people that they're not totally insane. If they can actually register a product in the FDA that only generates $2 million or $3 million a year like some products do, it may not be a sign of just absolute insanity or playing the lottery. It may be that there's a huge variation of what it costs to register products, and some products can be registered for a couple of $1 million, which is, in fact, I think, very accurate. Now, this is data from the Orphan Drug Act. They actually published data that no economist that studies the pharmaceutical industry ever really talks about much. It never appears much journals, but it's actual independent data. The companies have to sort of ask the government to get the tax credit, and they have to disclose what they spend on clinical trials. And this is how much they report for every orphan drug approval, which is an indication of a drug, not the basic drug, but it's still pretty important. For every tax return, for every application, for every designation, and for every marketing approval of a drug. Marketing approval is a risk-adjusted number because that means basically, because you get the tax credit whether the product's approved or not approved. And you could get it for, they basically get the credit for about 5 products for every 1 product that's actually approved. That's why I say it's risk adjusted. So that's basically what they're reporting. They're spending on clinical trials in a given year for every product that's approved. Most recently, about that I have data for, about $12 million. Now, these aren't typical of all drugs. These are drugs that I think Henry will say, and there's reasons to think that the numbers, this is just a tax credit, and you can argue that the numbers should be bigger for things that may not be captured by the credit. And you can say that these aren't typical, but none of the drugs are really typical. I would say a drug that has 25,000 patients in a clinical trial, and for 12 years isn't typical either. So I think what you see is a wide range of realities in terms of drug development costs. This is what the IRS returns say companies are actually spending out of their turnover to the development of new products. Now, this is Henry's model for the orphan drug. This is sort of similar to the pediatric extension. If you look at this, it's sort of like a little light thing here. You look at that little $4 million thing. That's basically how much money. Okay, I'm almost over here. Well, that's how much money the companies are spending on clinical trials in order to get this patent extension they get for these drugs. And you can see they're getting gazillions of dollars in patent extensions for putting out very little interest. So there's an efficiency issue. It's true that if you give somebody $1 billion, they'll do $4 million worth of trials. And it's true that if you're Bill Gates, that probably isn't going to really break the bank. But it's actually a very expensive way to pay for clinical trials. I'll skip over some of these things. Just want to mention to Fred that some people think economies of scale are more important than others do. And some people think that it was a huge mistake for the African group to split off from the Asians and the Latin Americans. And that's why the whole thing got completely screwed up in the paragraph 6 negotiations. And there was a lot of problems in that. Now, this is what we're supposed to be implementing. You actually have an affirmative obligation. We agreed to this to make sure that there's access to medicines for all. And here's this typical demand problem. People treated, get it for free, generic price, pay for the R&D, pay for the marketing, which is more expensive than the R&D. And there's people out there, it's not just a demand curve, there's people out there aren't getting the drugs. So the people on this side of the graph, we think the system works pretty good because we're basically living in the suburbs, driving BMWs, everything's fine. Those other people are not. And for a variety of indications, they're the people left out there. And so it's really a decision. Is this the way we want to fund R&D for the next 5,000 years or not? Can we come up with something better? Do we have to choose between innovation and no innovation? Well, not really. We can come up with something new. This is the Aventis radical IPR scenario. Note, not endorsed by Aventis. It was developed with them, but they've made it really crystal clear that if I advertise this, someone else got fired when I first put this on a slide because they said, well, you'll see. Okay. Anyway, treaty sets minimum national obligation to fund R&D. So we're thinking maybe 10 basis points, 15% of GDP. That's what they have to spend on R&D. We don't care what you do, how you fund it. Now, this is some data on retail pharmaceutical sales. Is not the whole enchilada, but it's close. And you can see over here that as a percent of GDP, it's remarkably similar from rich countries to poor countries. And I was a bit surprised by this. You see that India and UK are about the same. You see that Philippines and the US are at the high end of what percent of the GDP they're spending on pharmaceuticals. And I found, so that sort of makes this sort of idea of burden of GDP a lot simpler exercise than we anticipate. We don't have to use logarithms or anything like that. It looks like we could almost just come up with one number. And you can weight. Here's the kind of the simple idea we have. If you spend money on drugs, okay, so since the data says about 10% goes to develop new products, so we say, okay, if you spend $100 on drugs in your country, we credit that as $10 of funding R&D. If you do public sector research and you spend $100, that's considered $100 for us because it's all research. And some research we like more than others. So the open source stuff, we give you like bonus points. And maybe for drugs for neglected diseases. So if you spend money on malaria or something like that, we'll give you 150 points or something like that. That's kind of the model for this. This is sort of a way you might think about the U.S. market. $200 billion last year in pharmaceuticals, about $700 per capita, about nearly 2% of GDP right now, went up 31% in the last 2 years. Suppose you turned every drug into a generic, you could easily wipe out about $150 billion in the U.S. in 1 year on the drug bill. And if you notice that the $150 billion is bigger than the 20 or 30 billion you're getting out of the private sector companies for the research. So maybe there's some, some opportunities to do a little better, right? So that's kind of the idea there. So employers put money into a fund. They're forced to pay for R&D. They have to pay $200 per person. You can decide how much R&D you want and how happy you want to make the research community. And then we had sort of work on different models for how you'd actually spend the money. We wanted to avoid we were reminded by Ventus that the Soviet Union tried the central planning model back in 1917. So they wanted us to come up with something a little bit more, different. So we had this decentralized, bottom-up, competitive type model, where employers either would fund things, but expert would set objective criteria that you could actually sort of compete for to get allocations out of the fund on pharmacoeconomic criteria, which I think is not a bad proposal. Or you could have employees, people compete, intermediaries that do their research compete to employers to say, I do good research, give me your money. Or you could have a mixed model where you could have some done one way, some the other, and you could also come up with other things. And the last thing here is the Harare proposal. The WHO, this was a meeting of 16 African countries in 2001 that Fred and I were at. And basically the idea was you put a compulsory license on every product in the market. And you have a royalty that's paid, but it's not paid to the patent owner directly. It's paid into a fund to do research and development. The research and development is paid for in that country. You hire people from Africa to work in Africa, and the universities build up their institutions, and then you give the patent owner like a claim on the benefits of the fund. So if a fund comes up with something interesting, and it's like a global, very commercial discovery, like against being fat or something like that, then you get to cash in globally, but only if it does. And so it sort of says, you think it's great to invest in developing countries if they protect it. Well, this is sort of a model to do that. And what it does is it leads to sort of capacity building, gets them to sort of maybe look at things that are relevant to them in their country, keeps the foreign exchange from zipping out of countries which are basically tanking, keeps the prices closer to marginal cost. I can see my 2 minutes is going up that. So that's an idea that if you actually didn't just sort of start out with the idea that you have to do the things the way the commercial lobbyists have pushed it, you can imagine a whole lot of different things. And if you could, Johnny, justify it that at the end of the day, if you contribute the requisite amount of R&D in your country, of GDP, whatever you think is fair, you push these things in the right direction. In our opinion, we have a meeting on April 29th in Geneva to talk about this further. Thank you very much.
Good afternoon. I find it a little difficult sometimes listening to these wonderful plans about what we could do. As a South African and as a human rights lawyer, I look at a situation where 600 people are dying a day at the moment from HIV, AIDS-related disease just in South Africa, not the rest of Africa. 1,800 people will die in the time that we have this conference. So, what to do about this? Obviously, the blame lies firstly on my government, right? On the South African government. There is an activist group now that has charged, is attempting to charge through the legal system, both the Minister of Health and the Minister of Trade and Industry with culpable homicide. So it's creating quite an issue in the country. There's a civil disobedience campaign by the same activists. At the same time, one must ask, in this discussion, there's talk about genocide. One must ask, well, what blame is there for the law, for TRIPS, for the things that we are engaged in here? I'm also inspired by this conference, the talk about the economists and about their power to assume. And so I'm going to just briefly, because I really agree completely with the complexities that were spoken about by Fred Abbott. I'm a little more uncomfortable about the relationship between innovation and patent and those concerns, because after all, what my concern is the fact is there is a drug, they do exist. We're not worried about what might happen in the future. There are people dying now who need this drug now, which is what Fred is trying to work on. So, but what is this idea that I have to talk about, this idea of assumption that the economists so beautifully make? And that is, let's assume that, in fact, unlike the soft law, hard law distinction that we make between human rights law and patent rights, it's fascinating that the only private right in the whole international trading system is the TRIPS patent right, unlike all other trade-related issues. But let's assume that the soft law of WHO, of the Essential Medicines Program, after all, which pre-existed TRIPS, is in fact a real option, that is real law. There's, after all, 156 nations that have essential drug lists. So let's assume that those essential drug lists are off the table for the moment, that patents don't apply to those lists, because after all, they were in place prior to TRIPS. Now, of course, the answer to that is, and it is an answer about the nature of the essential drugs program, is that the way it was structured initially was to avoid patented drugs. And so when I first started doing work on this in South Africa in '97, people in the WHO said to me, don't talk about essential drugs program. It's not going to get you anywhere because it doesn't include the drugs you need to talk about. And they were absolutely right. Of course, the pressures that have developed since then mean that, as Fred pointed out, there are now 12 ARVs on the list, and so we're seeing some change there as well. Now, one way to justify this absurd assumption that I'm making is to say, well, what is in fact, if we talk about TRIPS happening in 1994, and it's actually interesting to me because in the South African case, the case that was initially brought when we started working on, or when work was done on the Initial Medicines Act that was challenged by the pharmaceutical company, HIV/AIDS was not on the table. That's not what we were dealing with. We were just talking about an essential drugs program to get access to cheaper drugs, period. And so, in a way, what you're talking about is a situation of changed circumstance. And any contract lawyer can tell you that changed circumstance matters. And so, one way to think about this is what we really have, instead of the settled expectations of TRIPS, is a situation where what HIV/AIDS did, at least in Africa, is change the circumstances under which TRIPS was initially negotiated. And on that basis, we can question the very basis of the private right that was protected in TRIPS. There's another part to the story that I'm interested in too, is that, well, we've tried to do that now. We've tried to do that through Doha and through a talk about interpreting the TRIPS agreement. And we hear from good friends and from others this talk about flexibility. That really TRIPS has flexibility inbuilt and it's provided. And I at first thought, well, here's another opportunity. Let's look at this flexibility and see where it can go. And you know, I cannot say that a lot of people have taken that advice in South Africa, right? And I began to wonder why. What is this? Why is this failure when we have such clear legal flexibility that's been pointed out so clearly by Carlos and others? And I've begun to believe that really what this flexibility is about, in fact, empowers the powerful. It empowers those that have power. Because what happened? If we go back to that South African case initially, this case was filed in '97, '98. And then for 3 years, nothing happened in the case. It did not move. There was no negotiations, nothing. In fact, what happened is government lawyers sent the pharmaceutical companies a letter saying, we won't pursue this, let's talk. And they said, fine. No talks took place, nothing happened. For 3 years, it was dead. And that's, in fact, if you talk, and in fact, earlier it was mentioned here, the strategies that the powerful can use to delay, to extend the time, to set the time horizons into the future. But if you're talking about 600 people dying a day, I mean, what's amazing is if this was a regular famine, or if this were civilian casualties in the war, this wouldn't be tolerable. But somehow, because it is illness and it has the morality and issues of sex, etc., this doesn't matter. We're not responding in the same way. I mean, as a human rights lawyer, I find that extraordinary. Right? That socioeconomic rights, those aren't real rights. Right? Instead, we will talk about patent rights. So I would suggest that one of the things we need, and it has been raised in the whole context of the Doha and Paris 6 negotiations, is this talk about Article 30 and the question of an exemption. What we really need at this point is legal certainty to allow the work that Fred Abbott and others are doing to get drugs produced and provided in a competitive context, not in terms of donations, etc. One of the things that I found interesting is if we talk about a situation where countries have to declare an emergency, there goes their tourist industry, there goes any other interest, right? So nobody's going to declare an emergency. We can't do that for many other reasons. There goes our political credibility at home. So we can't declare emergencies. We have to be allowed to do it as an exception. It's the only way that we can persuade our political leaders that this is an option. And then we need generic competition. Because, again, if it's just the drug companies lowering the price for the moment and for particular drugs, they've all proved quite adequately that that's not going to keep drug prices at an affordable level in developing countries. So I think this assumption that I've made, that we can put the essential medicines program ahead of TRIPS, and whatever justifications will come up for doing that, and maybe it will be about the negotiations for the next round that this will come up, that if we do that, the one thing we want to be clear about is we don't want the exceptions to be the exceptions, to be the soft law, to be the vague law. We need clarity, we need legal certainty on that, because that's the only way in which both the people who invest in generics and the governments will be prepared to take a step. Thank you.
I must thank this distinguished panel for the very good presentations. You would have noticed that our commentators did not follow the pattern of the other panels. The comments have, there's not really been a comment on the presentations. And I want to just say that I'd like to follow that trend. I won't be commenting on the presentations, which were very good, except there was one comment to rubbish another comment. but what I want to use my time for is to explain a little bit about decision-making processes in the WTO. Might be of interest to those of you who don't really know how this happens and how we landed up with a text like we did on the paragraph 6 negotiations. I mean, a text, for instance, that nobody likes. So how did we get to that stage? And also whether all countries have a voice, how does this process take place? Does the WTO end up only deciding in producers' interests and so on that we've heard today? In practice, the WTO follows the rule of consensus. Consensus doesn't mean that everybody has to actively agree, but that no member stands up to disagree. And there is, even though there is voting in writing, it's never been used in practice. There are 145 members of the WTO with varying interests. It's not just developed versus developing, not even in the TRIPS area. And one example is geographical indications, where on the extension of the protection given to wines and spirits to other products, there's been quite a complex interplay of alliances and so on. These negotiations are also, these positions also reflect the partnerships that countries have or members have in different areas, in other areas, for instance, agriculture and so on. And as somebody said, it just cannot be avoided, this kind of interplay in the WTO. There's no common point of view, as we saw even in the paragraph 6 negotiations, no common point of view amongst developing countries. And certainly, the public health issue was never at any point, formally or informally, linked with any other negotiations. The process started after Doha in March 2002, where there were initial discussions, and the Secretariat was asked to prepare some background papers on the geographical coverage of patented medicines and also on available information on manufacturing capacity. Now, we just used whatever was readily available, because there's no way that the small team that we have can really produce any original work. So we used whatever we had, completely to the dissatisfaction of all the members, I might say. In June 2002, there were 5 written proposals that were submitted. A compilation of views was prepared by us in the Secretariat, and that was the basis of discussions in July. These discussions were more structured this time because the compilation followed a certain structure, that is on the scope and coverage of the paragraph 6 mechanism, the eligibility of countries to export or import under this system, the safeguards and conditions, and the legal mechanism that should be used to implement any decision. There was also some proposals made particularly by the African group, which didn't fit in quite into the main system, and it was more on the transfer of technology, on the definition of domestic market, on economies of scale, and so on, which were also included in this compilation. In September, after our August break, the discussions were resumed, And this was based on a revised compilation which took into account the views that members had expressed in July. All these documents are available on our website. If anybody wants the numbers, I can give it to them. The informal consultations then continued on a regular basis and a very, very tight schedule from October to December. The chairman of the TRIPS Council, at that time the Mexican ambassador, put out what he called possible elements of a solution in a draft which was put out on 17th of October. This was heavily criticized and rejected by the developing countries, actually, mainly. There was a revised elements paper which the chair prepared, and that was put out on the 10th of November. This text of the 10th of November set the basis for the 16th December text, because at a mini-ministerial meeting in Sydney, it was basically approved by all the participants. It was just 25 countries, but those 25 countries said that this was a good basis to proceed and so on. So what then happened after the Sydney meeting was to convert the 10th November text, which seemed to be broadly acceptable to the members, to convert that into legal text. And after that, there were a few revisions, which finally ended up with a text which we put out on 24th of November, which took into account all the various views and tried to have a balanced position of all the views. The final text of 16th December, which is the text that is now on the table, evolved after intensive negotiations, and it is an attempt by the chair to reconcile all the different interests in a manner that is that he thought would be acceptable to the members. In fact, I just quote from the cover note of that text, that it's based on the extensive consultations that have been held on how to take into account, in a balanced way, the positions and concerns of the membership at large. It was circulated on the chairman's own responsibility, as these texts tend to be, these informal texts, recognizing that virtually all delegations will find that there are some provisions in it which they would prefer to see drafted differently. This was quite clear right from the beginning, that this was not a text which was the ideal text for any member. It was the chair's assessment at that time that all members, at least other than the United States, would be able to live with this text. Now, if you look at the US moratorium, which we've put out in a document, which is again on our website, you will see that the United States had problems not just with one issue, which was publicized quite a lot, that is the scope of coverage, but with a lot of issues such as eligible importing countries, the assessment of manufacturing capacity, conditions, and safeguards. You can see that if you compare what they've put into their moratorium with what is in the 16 December text. But they are on record in our meetings to say that they were agreeable, or basically the difference that they had was on only one paragraph of the 16 December text, which is paragraph 1A, which is on the scope of diseases or the scope of public health problems covered under this paragraph 6 mechanisms. There were 4 positions that our members had taken, and I think it's important to look at these 4 positions and then see what is in the 16 December text to see how the chairman of who was kind of coordinating this process tried to find a compromise language. The first position was that there should be no restrictions, no references to public health problems, because that's not necessary. Countries with manufacturing capacity don't have such restrictions, and there is no reason why countries without manufacturing capacity should have any such restrictions. The second position was there can be a reference to public health problems, but it should be a reference to the Doha Declaration as a whole and not to any one paragraph. And there was particular talk about reference to paragraph 4, which was put up in one of the earlier presentations on this panel. That is paragraph 4 of the Doha Declaration. The third position was, if there's a reference, we can live with a reference to the coverage of public health problems in paragraph 1 of the Doha Declaration, because we think that that is non-exhaustive, that reference to public health problems is non-exhaustive, and we can live with that. And the fourth position is that there should be a reference only to 3 specific diseases, which are referred to in paragraph 1 of the Doha Declaration, which is HIV/AIDS, malaria, and TB. or other infectious epidemics of comparable scale and gravity, including those that may arise in the future. And this is the position of the United States. Now, position number 3, which is the reference to public health problems, was incorporated into the 16 December text to address public health problems as recognized in paragraph 1 of the Doha Declaration, leaving it ambiguous and hoping that this constructive ambiguity would meet the requirements of all the members. This was the chairman's best assessment of how to reconcile these 4 widely differing positions. Now, clearly, we all agree that there should be, all the members agree that there should be a multilateral solution. They are on record on this. But at the moment, there seem to be no new ideas of how to bridge the gap and how to actually get there. Maybe we need to have model mongering, according to Peter. So that maybe we need some creative thinking, and maybe the group here could think of something which could move the process forward. I'd like to thank all the members of the panel. I think we've had a really interesting discussion, and now I'd like to open the floor to questions. For questions, yeah. Yeah. Please.
Yeah. I just wanted to say that I disagree with Heinz that when people starve, we find it intolerable. I would argue that people are actually more susceptible to disease because they're malnourished, and that's due to lack of nutrition and adequate calories. And as a world, we don't actually show that we care about that very much. And when you deal with organizations or foundations with an interest in health, it's often difficult for them to consider nutrition as part of the picture. At the same time, I am worried, as you are, about people dying and dying because of lack of access to essential medicines. And I guess my question is really to Fred, though. I just wanted to see if there are parallels between what you talked about with essential drugs and these same sorts of concepts in agriculture, knowing that there are large technical and scientific differences. I mean, we have essential drugs being to health, maybe what are, needing to determine what are and will be essential resources, whether these are genetic resources or related technologies that are essential to food security. We have orphan diseases, well, we have orphan crops. And I would argue in the age of biotechnology, we're going to even have orphan traits, so that we may have interest in herbicide resistance in the United States, but drought resistance in Africa, and that those traits will probably not be paid attention to in the same way. So I guess I'd break my question down into 2 parts. One, looking at the process of the creation of this essential drug list and the process by which ARV drugs were added. How did they determine what was essential and ensure that it was meaningful, having these ARV drugs that were added? This has obviously evolved, and are there parallels that we might find useful from my field? And secondly, what's the relationship in reality between the placement on the list and access? And if the correlation is weak, what kinds of mechanisms do we need to create so that the access is real?
Yes, please.
My name is Brooke Baker, and I'm also an AIDS activist from Health Gap. And my question is, it's quite obvious from the presentations that the major problem is U.S. unilateralism, that the policies pursued by the U.S., both in TRIPS negotiations and also in bilateral and plurilateral negotiations, are continuing to reduce access to necessary life-saving medicines. And I know this body is going to have a meeting, a lunch tomorrow, to talk about the kind of effort that this group might take to advance public interest positions with respect to intellectual property issues. And I would urge this group to continue to consider stating positions of the U.S. Trade Representative, both as a result of this conference and in an ongoing way. So I guess my question to the panelists is, legal academics have been extraordinarily inactive in public condemnation of U.S. policy. Jamie's website lists leading academics from medical schools, schools of public health, human rights organizations, that have condemned U.S. negotiating policies, and yet no group of legal academics has apparently submitted a similar petition or position to that body. So why aren't we taking active political stances with respect to transparently unlawful negotiating positions by the U.S., let alone immoral positions?
Can I ask Fred to try and tackle these two questions, and then anybody else who wants to chip in? Jamie.
Regarding the first question, I mean, there certainly, I think, are parallels between the question of access to medicines and the questions of access on technology relating to foodstuffs and food security and so forth, and a necessity to provide mechanisms for access to, innovation in agricultural technology and so forth. I suppose now, and I have been involved peripherally, in fact, a few years ago with the, plant genetic resources negotiations and so forth, and the problems that came up in TRIPS. I recall that when there was an initial proposal that any patented innovations be subject to a royalty payment into the multilateral fund for provision to farmers, et cetera, the U.S. objected that that was a violation of Article 27.1's restriction on field of technology and so forth. But, I mean, be that it may, that's a technical issue. The issues are similar. Professor Cotier here is working extensively on these food security and access issues and so forth. But I guess in a short space of time, it's difficult for me to draw, quickly the parallels between the two situations. And I suppose one of the aspects of it is a question of immediacy, in the sense that as I perceive the current world food supply situation, it is more a question of adequate distribution of a stock that is largely sufficient at the moment, and that what we're talking about over the longer term is access to resources that could improve the situation. So perhaps it's a question of immediate need versus longer term need at this side, but perhaps I'm not even assessing that properly from your standpoint as to what you might see as immediacy. But they're both issues of access to innovation and under what conditions and whether they'll be public. As to the essential medicines list, I mean, it basically was a question. I mean, it was fundamentally obvious to anyone looking at the problem that antiretroviral medicines are essential medicines throughout the world. I mean, that wasn't an issue, but at the time, the price of an ARV was $8,000 per year treatment, and you were trying to create a list for people who had $30 a year in a public health budget applicable to medicines. It just seemed nonsensical, I suppose, to the people compiling the list to put those on the list as essential medicines. And at the point where there was endless harping, but every time a pharma representative got up to speak, the first thing they said was, there's no patented drugs on the essential medicines list, therefore patents aren't a problem. I mean, at some point, you just say, well, even if people can't afford them, we're going to put them on the list and at least stop them from making that argument. I'm not sure that there was any rocket science behind it other than that. And, of course, you have the more expensive, multi-drug resistant malarial medicines and so forth, which are also fairly expensive that got on the list. But I don't want to attribute it to being too mysterious of a process. I mean, it was simply a matter of saying we're going to change our focus. Rather than necessarily emphasizing affordability, we also have to recognize need for treatment, and maybe by putting it on the list, we'll make people recognize that somebody has to pay for these as essential medicines. On Brooke Baker's comment, well, he's quite right. I mean, the legal community in the United States, and the most difficult, the most problematic community has always been the intellectual property community and really the patent community in the United States in terms of legal academics. There's actually very little sympathy among legal academics on the patent side in the United States for the idea that patent protection might be weakened to provide access to essential medicines. I would go so far as to say the most difficult audiences I talk to in the United States are academics and certainly professionals concerned with the patent system, because the first thing they say is, you can't weaken the patent system or we won't have new drugs, and I hate to be hard-hearted about it, but unless we maintain the patent system, the whole thing is going to be destroyed and we're not going to have any new innovation. And this happened at Berkeley 2 years ago in a conference, so just constant repetition of that rejoinder. And you would say to people, well, I'd really like to take you to Africa and sit you down in a clinic with 100 emaciated people dying of horrible diseases and have you explain to them that you hate to be hard-hearted, but you really have to enforce the patent, and they're going to die, but we're going to be better in the future because someone's going to invent some new medicines. I have changed. I'm sorry, I'm going on too long. I used to give these talks, with a moral edge, right? How can we be letting these things happen? I don't do that anymore. I mean, no one's affected.
Yeah. Should we take a question from Professor Cote, and then maybe you can respond after that, Jamie?
Okay.
Thank you. Well, I just wanted to make a comment and actually support Rebecca's view that I think the law is not the problem here. And I say this as a former negotiator who went through the negotiations of this whole agreement. And I just like to make the point that I think this agreement today is sold below its value. And everybody believes that negotiators at the time were not aware of the health problems. And that's flatly wrong. I mean, Joshua was negotiating for India, and she may have her own views. But if you look at Article 11, health is mentioned. If we go through Article 31, this is the most extensive negotiation and text and compulsory licensing. It doesn't mention the purpose. You can take a compulsory license for whatever public policy you want to take. If you look at the Article F, it says you can only have compulsory licensing predominantly for the supply of your domestic markets. That means African countries can grant compulsory licensing for importation of products. Now, if a Western company then bans the export of a drug from another country with the reasons invoking their patents, I think that would be a case to invoke Article K, which allows to go around Article F in case this is an anti-competitive conduct, and that even could be deducted from the amount of remuneration. So please do read these provisions very carefully. My view is that the problem could be solved fairly easily. Why do we have these negotiations? Now there is, of course, the human rights aspect, which I do respect, but the other part is just bloody trade policy. It's about market shares. Some countries have to introduce patent protection by the 1st of January 2006. Now, this strategy has been used partly to try to extend, in a way, the time you get until these obligations really have to take in. And that is the trade policy side of it, which has to be taken. The interesting lesson we can learn from this case, I think, is you clearly have to distinguish the legal side, but that's not good enough. There is a psychological level, there's a trade policy level, there is a human rights level, and there is a psychological level on top of it. And unfortunately, our political masters and the industry were not able to really deal with all these layers. But let me finish. I believe that the law is not the problem here, and we should not start from the premises that people at the time who negotiated these agreements were simply not aware that these problems exist.
And I agree that the TRIPS isn't the problem. I mean, I think that in general, I think that there are issues about the TRIPS. There's some rough edges that deserve some attention, but I completely agree with your assessment that within the TRIPS, you can issue a compulsory license for any reason you want. And of course, the European Commission has done it recently, despite what Fred said about the field of technology in the area of genetically modified crops, where they have mandatory compulsory licensing on genetically modified crops to plant breeders if they develop innovations based on the genetically modified crop, which is fairly field specific. And the EU, in correspondence to us, has said in their opinion that that's consistent with the TRIPS agreement based upon the jurisprudence of the Canadian Bowler case, where they allowed some differentiation. It's also, in addition to the Article 31 case, which we think, and I agree completely with you, is an avenue that countries should explore because it allows exports without limitation. And in fact, the U.S. uses Article 31 frequently in order to issue compulsory licenses to export products all over the place. That both the United States and Canada have been using Article 30 of the TRIPS, the exceptions clause, to permit exports. And now in the new EU legislation, the European Parliament, at the request of the European Commission, intends to introduce that into the Canadian law. So they intend to permit exports of products under Article 30 under the early working. And it seems to me that among the many failures of the people that are working on the Paragraph 6 negotiation, which has turned out to be kind of a cancer on the whole process and just a colossal string of errors from one end to the other, is just a failure to make a coherent explanation why the legitimate interest of the patent owner is not to divide up the world like the blind people see the problem in the copyright thing. So you have to have unbelievably inefficient levels of production, where if you have public interest license, you don't have to have a factory in 200 different countries to make a product. And because all the evidence is that on some products, economies of scale and scarcity of know-how is really, really, really important. Certainly for ARVs, it turns out to be the case in terms of the active ingredients and things like that. So I agree that the TRIPS agreement isn't really the fundamental problem, but there are problems in national laws, there's problems in implementing the laws, and there are huge problems in bilateral pressure to this day. And I certainly applaud what Brooke said, because in addition to saying something and speaking out about the outrageous situation where the U.S. gave an IOU to get a new trade around and promised to fix this issue in the exports in a more liberal way than it currently exists with Article 31K, to make it easier for countries. And we're completely reneging on that deal in total bad faith negotiations. All the guys at USTR say it's completely because Karl Rove, Josh Bolton, and Gary Edson in the White House have basically completely taken control of the negotiations, and they're completely out of the loop, and they have no flexibility whatsoever to make policy at USTR on this issue. And everything they say is dictated, as Fred had indicated, by the big pharmaceutical companies. And it's a complete disgrace. And where I come from, you make a deal and then you renege on it. It speaks poorly on your own character to not live up to your promises. And I think that's the way the rest of the world looks at this deal.
Why can't unilaterally at this point, because there's a bad faith renege, unilaterally use the power under the declaration as it stood, the issue in Article 30? Sure.
No, they can. They can. Yeah, actually, they can, and that's absolutely, yeah. Yeah.
I mean, I think that's
completely agree, yeah.
With due respect, that was Fred's point.
The mic.
Sorry. I mean, that was Fred's point, and the point that I try to highlight is not that law's the problem. I agree that TRIPS on its face as a piece of formal law, we could use it. The problem is the symbolic power of law. When the PMA in South Africa filed the suit, they made a lot of allegations, which in the end were proved to be not acceptable, but for 3 years, nothing happened. Why? Because the government lawyers didn't have the capacity. They had to wait until they could find somebody like Fred to come and talk to them. And the whole thing just stood still. And they used that power again and again. Now, you ask some manufacturer in the South African context, are you going to put your money up to start putting together a production line to produce the drugs when you're not sure what the government lawyers are going to do tomorrow or the next day? They're not going to put their money up. That's the symbolic power of law. And that's why it's the uncertainty that exists within the system, the soft law version versus the right that is clearly established, that allows this gaming, if you like, as the other term that's been used for it, to go on.
I'd like to respond to what Jerry said, because I think that, in fact, the problem is, had the countries not had Paragraph 6, they would have been better off, because without Paragraph 6, they had the rest of the Doha Declaration, which was really strong, and they could have taken it up to a panel, they would have done pretty good. Now the problem they've got is they got involved in this really inept negotiation on the paragraph 6. They completely clouded everyone's idea about what even the rest of the declaration says, and they've prejudiced a possible outcome by presenting a really rotten possible solution on the export issue. So in a way, I think they've undermined even their options under Article 31K, because you could imagine a fairly liberal interpretation of Article 31K, and you can imagine it being more difficult today than it was a year ago, because, no, what I'm saying is the Article 30 thing have been prejudiced by the negotiations in paragraph 6. What was supposed to actually expand the rights of developing country has been used as a weapon against them to basically create kind of a soft law interpretation in sort of a political environment where the rights they had prior to the declaration are now even in some respects possibly worse off. So I'm saying it's been an atrocious negotiation. It was a great negotiation going up to Doha. It was a fabulous 6 months going up to Doha. You had all the things. You had the trial. You had the anthrax scare. You had Canada pulling, panicking. You had all that stuff. It was perfect. You get up there. Solidarity, Africa, Latin America, everybody was together, it was everybody. Carlos was on the ground, in Doha. It was perfect, You got out of town, and then things just got all screwed up. But the drug companies had enough after Doha. They went to the White House. They got tight with the White House. They slapped around USTR. They slapped around the Council of Ministers in Europe. Things got bad there. And then the negotiations fell apart because some very bad advice was made to basically break up the team. Africa tried to pursue this ridiculous protectionist strategy against the Indians and the Brazilians, and it was a disaster. And they dug themselves a real deep hole, and now it's really a mess. And we were very glad the U.S. government stopped at the end. We all were like champagne time when the U.S. stopped at the end, because nobody wanted that solution to go forward.
I think we should.
Well, I have something to say.
Okay.
Excuse me, Jerry. But, just to set the record straight, although I've said it, I think it's been overlooked. The whole discussion has been about HIV/AIDS. And on the paragraph 6 issue, even the United States has included HIV/AIDS. So as far as they are concerned, none of the WTO members are saying that you cannot relax 31F if it is to export medicines under HIV/AIDS. The US has given this moratorium, and so has Switzerland and the European communities, Australia, Hungary for some reason. And so it's quite, what I'm saying is, if any country today has manufacturing capacity and has a patent in its country and wants to export an HIV/AIDS medicine, it doesn't look like any of the WTO members are really against that.
Well, plus, you can do it from India right now and China. I mean, every ARV you want, you can, next couple, nothing you want to get, you can't get today. It's all about the future. It's all about after 2006. It's not about any product that's on the market right now anyhow.
Thank you.